24, yes. Prop 24, Prop 24, yes. Prop 24, Prop 24, yes. Prop 24, Prop 24, yes. Don't sell my data, lose my location, my health, my race, religion, and whatever else you're saving, it's not yours to keep. I do not give you permission, don't be a creep. Stay out of the children's business. They should pay a fine. They should pay a fine. When they don't comply, invading all the people's rights. This data's hers, this data's his, this data's yours, this data's mine. Prop 24, vote yes for your data rights. Prop 24, Prop 24, Prop 24, Prop vote yes. Prop 24, Prop 24, 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 yes. Yo, it's time we take back our data. Vote yes, Prop 24, California.
All right, hello everyone. I am Jess with the California Yang Gang. Thank you so much for spending part of your weekend with us. A special thanks also goes to Jacob and Nathan, who helped create the song and video that started us off today. So why are we here? Well, in the digital age, privacy is power. Data privacy is a hugely consequential issue. Entire industries are built on the use of our data, but it doesn't get a lot of mainstream recognition. Today, we're hoping to change that. This panel will feature 4 privacy experts, each of whom approaches the subject in a different way. We'll get into the broader privacy landscape and also the finer points of Prop 24, the privacy law on the ballot in California this November. After the panelists introduce themselves, we'll have a round of Q&A moderated by the incomparable Andrew Yang. Afterwards, we'll have time for a few audience questions. These are mostly going to be selected from the event registration forms you all filled out. At the end, we'll let you know where to find more information. So without further ado, I will pass things on to Andrew Yang so we can get right into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I love that rap song. It made me feel like I was back on the campaign trail. There were all sorts of creative members of the Yang Gang that were making it happen. Thrilled to moderate this panel. I love moderating. This is a little known fact about Andrew Yang, but I just like to moderate because I don't have to do that much, especially when it comes to a panel like this one where we have world-class experts who've been working on privacy-related issues for a long time. So I'm going to introduce them according to their Zoom appearance on my screen, which is probably completely arbitrary. We're going to start with Enoch Liang, the CEO of the Data Dividend Project, an old dear friend of mine. So Enoch, go ahead and introduce yourself over the next minute or two before we start passing the baton. Enoch Liang.
Hey, Andrew. Good to see you. And thanks to the California Yang Gang for hosting this panel. My name is Enoch Liang. I went to law school with Andrew way back in the late 90s, and I'm the CEO of the Data Dividend Project, which was created to start a movement to help Americans collectively take back and collectively bargain for their data privacy and data property rights. And DDP was actually inspired by 3 things, Andrew, as you know. The first was the statements you made on the presidential debate stage about data rights and data ownership. The second, thanks to Alastair, the authorized agent provisions in the California Consumer Privacy Act. And then the third was Jaron Lanier's writings and philosophy about data as labor, data unions, and collective bargaining.
Thank you, Enoch. I was thrilled to get involved because of the fact that Prop 24 can help make real some of the principles I was running on at the time during my presidential campaign. I'm thrilled that our campaign has now evolved into this movement around data rights, among other things. Now, Jim Steyer, the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media, which maintains a community of tens of millions of parents around the country who are interested in making sure that the content our kids see is healthy, wholesome, and positive for them. And what's fascinating, and Jim talks about this, like he's a kids programming guy, but that actually ends up leading very directly towards data and privacy rights. Jim Steyer, the CEO of Common Sense Media.
Hey, great to be here, Andrew. Great to see everybody on the screen too. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to the Yang Gang and to Alistair for pulling this together. This is a great panel. So, you know what I do? I am the CEO of Common Sense Media. We're the leading kids media and advocacy group in the United States. And we do have tens and tens of millions of users. We've been really pushing the privacy issue since about 2011, 2012. And at that time, it felt like we were lone voices in the wilderness because privacy is a fundamental right in this society. And the privacy of kids and teens, which is our primary focus at Common Sense, is really paramount. So it's been great to work with Alistair and Celine. We were really the partners who passed the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act in 2018, which is the landmark law in the United States. It was a great partnership with Alistair. And we actually got every single legislator in California to ultimately vote yes. It is the landmark privacy law in the United States. And we now have worked closely with Alistair, but also with you, Andrew, and Enoch, and our friend Shoshana Zuboff, who we'll be hearing from in a second, to make it clear that privacy is a fundamental right for our kids, for our families, for all consumers. This is an incredibly important moment because California is leading the nation on this issue. And essentially, we are setting the framework and the path for all American citizens and kids and families and consumers to follow. It's why we're such big supporters of Prop 24, which we're going to get into. And I'm just delighted to be here with such a great group of people on a Sunday afternoon. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Jim, for all the work you've done and continue to do. Next, we have Shoshana. I should call you Professor Shoshana Zuboff because you're a professor at Harvard Business School, author of several really influential books, including The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which delves into many of these issues, and one of the foremost thinkers on privacy rights and what they mean for our democracy. Professor Shoshana Zuboff, I'm screwing that up pretty badly. Professor Zuboff, welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I've heard it screwed up much worse, so don't worry about it. I would take my couple minutes of introduction to do some stage setting for our conversation. If I happen to go past a couple minutes, I promise to take less time on some of my questions, but I thought this might be valuable for all of us, because we're here to discuss, on the one hand, privacy, but on the other hand, law. So I want to speak a little bit to how those two things converge. So I'd like to start with a little thought experiment through the 20th century. Imagine we're making our way through the 20th century, the industrial century, without any laws to prohibit child labor, without any laws to assert minimum wage standards or fair wage standards, without the rights to join a trade union, to bargain collectively, without the right to strike. Imagine that there are no consumer rights, no institutions for the oversight of safe products, foods, and medicines, and no institutions to oversee worker health, safety, industrial relations, fair trade and competition. Imagine we have no institutions for environmental protection, or for public health and housing, or for education. No social safety nets like Social Security, unemployment insurance, healthcare. These institutions, these laws, these rights were born of a creative struggle. Some in the 1920s, many in the 1930s. They were born in a creative struggle as citizens and lawmakers endeavored to figure out how can we have an industrial society that is also a democracy. And it is the fruit of that effort that produced the rights and the laws and the institutions that I've just talked about. The problem as I see it, Andrew and Alistair and Enoch and Jim, the problem as I see it is that we have yet to undertake this kind of work for the 21st century, for the digital century.
Yeah.
This is not a story about technology, and it's not a story about data. It's a story about law and institutions. Our failure so far, we've had 2 decades under our belt, and our failure so far as we enter the 3rd decade is that we have left a void where the rule of law under democratic institutions should be. That void, like every void in a society, is filled by power. And in our case, in our time, this power means the power of surveillance capitalism. These are the grounds of our historical condition right now. And this is a condition that diminishes democracy and advantages oligarchy. We live in a world where 99% of all information is digitally stored. This is a fact that's only about 20 years old. In 2002, it was still only about 25% of the world's information. Then it quickly moved to about half of the world's information. And by 2007 or so, it was 97% of the world's information. So this is something that has happened very, very quickly. The problem is that this 99% of the world's information is largely owned. They are considered these data are considered proprietary assets that are owned by just a handful of companies, really the large surveillance capitalists. And that allows them to operate like information empires, unprecedented concentrations of wealth, knowledge, and the unaccountable power that accrues to that kind of knowledge. Most of this information is human generated. That means it's lifted from our lives without our understanding, outside of our awareness, which is to say, we're talking about children. So it's important to note here, if you describe this to any child, they will say, oh, they stole it. That's right. These are stolen goods, these data. And they are encapsulated in this economic logic that was invented at Google, migrated to Facebook, became the default object, the default logic for the tech sector, but is now moving at a rapid pace through the entire economy, what we think of as the normal economy. And the only thing that has made this possible is almost a near perfect absence of law. Since 2010, at least, the Chinese government has evolved a very specific vision of the digital future, one that is designed to advance their form of government. The Chinese are an authoritarian state, and they have a vision of the digital future that is the basis for their domestic and foreign policy that is intended to advance their form of authoritarian government. In contrast, the liberal democracies have utterly failed to do the same. We have not created the vision, the laws, the charters of rights, and so forth, that we need to construct a digital future that is compatible with the aspirations of a democratic people. The result is, and now just again, here's my analogy to the 20th century. The result is that today, in the year 2020, we are marching naked through the digital century without the charters of rights, the institutions, the legal frameworks, the regulatory paradigms, and indeed the forms of leadership that we require to make the digital future compatible with democracy. All of our deliberations must be aimed at addressing these facts. And that's why I'm here right now with my friends, so honored to have the opportunity to discuss Proposition 24, because this is a piece of privacy law that actually moves forward our frontier, and allows us to undertake this crucial work that I've just been describing. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoshana. That was incredible. That was historic in its context provision. I loved it. And I love the metaphor, the image of us stumbling naked through the 21st century digital economy. And Prop 24 is going to get us some clothes. It's going to get us like a
Prop
maybe even
24.
like a suit of armor, like some chainmail.
Absolutely. A nice shawl to begin the outfit.
Yeah, at least a sweater. It's at least a sweater. And one of the key knitters of this sweater has been Alastair McTaggart, who is the chairman of Californians for Consumer Privacy. Alastair helped make the CCPA a reality in the last round, but now he's back and we're back to raise the floor, the threshold of how our data gets treated. Alastair McTaggart. Alastair, welcome.
Well, thanks, Andrew. And thanks, everybody, for taking time out of a weekend to be here. I'll just say that for me, you know, Shoshana, you talked about it being an honor. For me, it's truly an honor to be here. You know, Shoshana and Jim have something in common. Actually, Jim's a professor too. I think he has one of the largest courses at Stanford available every year. And what links both of them in my mind is way before it was popular, way before it was a thing, they were the voices in the wilderness putting their hands up saying, hey, there's something coming that is not great for society. Neither of them are anti-technology, but they're both worried about the unimpeded use of some of that technology. And so for me, they're both sort of lighthouses, sort of beacons of warning. And they're both authors. And for anybody who hasn't read Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capital, Jim's got a new book, Which Side of History. People should read these because they're intellectuals who talk about this. So it's really an honor in the world of privacy. And that they're kind of some of my inspiration for getting into this. You know, this technology didn't exist. Now it exists. And now we need to do something about it. So I look forward to the discussion today.
Me too, Alastair. Where's your book? No, I'm kidding. So some people are watching this online. They're probably nodding their heads. They're thinking like, wow, this is really interesting. I would love for us to try and put into layperson's terms why the average American should care. Like, let's say I'm in California, I'm watching this. I don't know what to think about Prop 24. These people seem good. These people seem like they're trying to make something positive happen. But let's say that this doesn't pass, or, you know, like we weren't having this conversation. There was no Prop 24. Why should the average Californian, the average American care at all? And so, Enoch, I'm going to start with you. Like, why should the average American care?
Well, I think I'm going to leave the discussion about democracy and addiction for kids to Professor Zuboff and Professor Steyer. I'll just start with a very simple analogy. You know, in the offline world, in the real world, imagine that you buy a house, right? Everybody knows that their house is their castle. You have the right to control who comes into your house. You have the right to exclude others from your house. You have the right to put up a no trespassing sign, etc. Now imagine the online world with Google Nest, with Google Home, those types of the Alexa speakers. Imagine if the online world's rules applied to your offline house. So you buy a house, but in this house, anybody can come into it and listen to your conversations, see what medications and vitamins you're taking, write down what you watch on your TV, see what articles you're reading in the newspaper, you know, when you're arguing with your spouse or your kids, and then you use that to target ads, to target commercials to you. Nobody would stand for that in the offline world. And the reason I think everyday Americans should care is you also should not stand for that in the online world, because that's what's happening.
Oh, well said, Enoch. Jim, you've been looking at this from a family perspective for quite some time. Like, what got you animated about it, and why should the everyday American care?
You know, I'm the father of 4 kids. And, you know, Andrew, when I first started looking into this about a decade ago, I am a professor at Stanford. I teach con law to undergrads. And by the way, Andrew was in my class 2 weeks ago and was a fabulous guest. But the thing is, it's a fundamental right. There's only a couple of fundamental rights in the United States: the right to vote, the right to travel, the right to privacy. And by the way, it's the basis of much of our important constitutional gains and con law in the last 100 years in this society. But I'll tell you, it's really basic for our kids. I think Enoch said it very well. You know, we don't want our kids to become normalized to surveillance. We want them free to grow up as normal human beings, to make mistakes, to find their voices. You know, just imagine if everything that you did as a teenager, God forbid, had been recorded and was searchable to the entire world, right? And that every mistake you'd ever made was available that you did as a teenager or as a preteen. Well, if you don't have privacy protections, that's basically the truth. And it's what sort of animated our efforts to do Prop 24, and then previously with Alistair, the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's sort of basic to all of what we do. Imagine if everything that you ever said to your spouse or to your kids or all the personal decisions that you made is open to everybody and was surveilled for economic purposes. But that's exactly the paradigm that Shoshana laid out for us in her Harvard Business School lecture at the beginning here, which was so good, because that's what's at stake. And the truth is, until we got together a few years ago and started passing these laws in California, this was fundamentally at risk because a small number of tech companies basically told us privacy didn't matter anymore. So the bottom line for me is really my 4 kids, Andrew, and young people who have the right to live in a society without everything they do and every mistake recorded and monetized. Pretty simple.
No, it was Lawrence Lessig that said that our current structures are making us all into liars because we all keep clicking, I read these terms and conditions and I agree, and no one actually reads that. You know, they're always like clicking and being like, oh, I sure hope whatever they're doing is not that terrible. Alistair, you've invested a tremendous amount of your time, energy, resources. Why do you think the average Californian should care, and why do you care so deeply?
Well, I think, like there are 1,000, examples you can point to of how insidious this technology is in creeping into your life and sort of taking over your life, whether it's, all of our kids are online right now all the time, and me worrying about, is my kid not going to get a job in 25 years because some app that they uploaded their homework to today records something about them. I do think what Shoshana said, this is about power, ultimately. There are a handful of companies now in the world that are more powerful than any corporation has ever been before. I like to say that Standard Oil was a powerful corporation. Standard Oil didn't know everything about you. And you think about governance, these companies are governed by 2 or 3 people each, or 1 person each. And they have more power than literally any human has almost ever had on the planet. And so it's, in general, in a democracy, we kind of think about checks and balances. There are not a lot of checks and balances here. We in California are just trying to get some decent checks and balances here on this power.
Well, I will say on a personal level, I'm glad I ran for president at a time where no one had any idea how I spent my teenage years. May it always be thus. Let everyone be able to keep their teenage years in obscurity. For me, Shoshana, you're touching on democracy. Like, I could not agree more that right now our democracy is getting influenced and subverted by what's happening to our data. Why do you think the average American should care in this election season as we're all registering to vote and voting?
Well, you're right, Andrew. It's never been more urgent. So let me mention 3 reasons why everybody needs to care. Privacy rights and democracy are twin-born. You literally cannot have one without the other. A society that cherishes privacy that is not a democracy, to my knowledge, does not exist. And it's only by virtue of democratic institutions that we have any guarantees of rights, including privacy rights. Privacy rights are what allow us to be autonomous, sovereign individuals. Without that, democracy is unimaginable. So let's start from that premise. So during the past 2 decades, something else has been up, and that is companies and governments have essentially declared war on individual privacy. And like every war, this one comes with great propaganda. And the key propaganda here is the idea that privacy is something private. That privacy is about some little calculation, some little trade-off that you make. And you say, well, I'll give a little bit of data, and in return, I get this really cool free service. So I'm in control, I know what I'm doing, I can handle it. All of that is a lie. Let me explain why. First of all, you know, the great Bertrand Russell, one of my idols, he said that whenever you hear anybody talking about the word free, you always have to ask the question, free from what? So in this case, we're talking about free services. Free from what? Well, what we know is that they are not free from surveillance capitalism. The way they accumulate wealth is by essentially spying on us, using that knowledge to ultimately influence and control behavior at the level of the individual and the population. So there's nothing free there. And therefore, the idea that this is a reasonable trade-off, a reasonable calculation, is dead in the water before we get started. Number two, leaked memos and whistleblowers and informants are really important when you're trying to understand surveillance capitalism. So we have a leaked memo from a leaked document from Facebook a couple of years ago, and it describes Facebook's AI hub, which I think of as its manufacturing core. And in its AI hub, they say they ingest trillions of data points every day and produce 6 million predictions of human behavior every second. That's the scale we're talking about, friends. At that scale, the little bit of data that I know I gave them, that's a tiny, tiny fraction of those trillions of data points that they have about us and about people like us and about people in our population and all around the world. So again, the idea that we can somehow control what we give is, again, dead in the water. It's simply not true. Finally, take something like this. Microsoft facial recognition, it has a data set that was famous called MS Celeb. And this was supposed to be the most advanced data set for training artificial intelligence in the wild. Recognize anybody's face, anywhere, anytime. So it turns out that this was supposed to be used just for academic research. Lo and behold, we discovered that they were selling it to various military operations, including the military division of the Chinese army that was tasked with imprisoning Uyghur Muslims in detention camps where they are monitored 24/7 with the very best frontier facial recognition. Where do you think those faces came from? Microsoft Celeb. Where do you think that data set came from? Well, it came from the photos I sent to my grandma because she lives in another state. And it came from the photos I sent to my son when he was away at university. And all of your family photos and all of your family's family photos and on in an infinite regress. Your picture walking down the street, your picture sitting in a cafe. What we give has consequences because we are contributing to systems of monitoring and control that affect our lives, but also affect everyone else's lives. That's number three. So the bottom line, privacy is not private. Privacy is public. A society that destroys privacy cannot be a society that cherishes individual sovereignty, without which democracy is impossible.
Thank you, Shoshana. That was, again, incredible. I remember when Zuckerberg was testifying before Congress, and then a member of Congress said, like, how do you all make money? Because they thought it's like, well, this is free. But we all know that Facebook now is generating tens of billions of dollars a year in annual revenue. And so one of the things I said online is we should be getting paid by Facebook at this point. Like, it's not even that free, that we could talk about, that was obviously just trying to point out like that there's a massive amount of value that's getting sucked away. So I think we've done a pretty good job of articulating a big problem to folks who are watching this. They were like, wow, like these actually seem like profound issues. So the next question is how the heck does Prop 24 help matters? You know what I mean? Like now we painted a picture of this this massive need. So Alistair, I'm going to start with you on this because you are the champion. We all, you know, we're all supportive of Prop 24, but you were the person who was closest to making it happen. So Alistair, how does Prop 24 help?
Thanks. You know, Prop 24 would give Californians essentially the equivalent of the best privacy protections in the world. Right now, Europe, essentially, there's a law called GDPR there. They have the sort of the highest privacy protections. And Prop 24 would give Californians those same rights. And I won't cover all of them, but just some of them are that'll resonate with people. The creation of a new category of sensitive personal information. And that's stuff that's like your religion, your health information, your biometrics, your genetics, your sexual orientation, your race. And that's so powerfully personal that you should be able to have the right to tell a business you can't even use that information. And one of my favorites there is your precise location. It would let you draw a circle about 250 acres big around you and say, okay, fine, you can know I'm an Oakland resident to say, you know, show me an ad for a car dealership in Oakland. But you don't have to know that I'm actually at the health clinic or the fast food restaurant or the synagogue. And so this lets you really start taking control back. One of the really issues that resonates, I think, especially right now is this issue of profiling. It would let you say, you know, are you creating profiles about me? Am I only seeing certain jobs because of my work history, my health history, my race? How do I even know? And how do I stop that profiling? How do I learn about it? Enforcement, we create much more robust enforcement. This would allow, not only it would create a dedicated enforcement agency, but not only that, this would now allow every county, their district attorney in the state to enforce it, and all the 4 big city attorneys. So you have much more enforcement. And then the final thing that I think is most important almost about this law is what I saw in 2019 was business. They are all out to try to weaken privacy, even after we passed CCPA with Jim and common sense.
No, Alistair, you mean that they didn't see that law and say like, oh, we should really rethink our practices? That was not the.
I was so naive, but Jim's group and we spent all of 2019 in Sacramento defending the law. There were efforts to remove all insurance companies from the law, to remove all vehicle data from the law, to remove all behavioral advertising from the law. So this Prop 24 would create a floor and say nothing can pass that weakens consumer privacy. But anything else, simple majority, go back to Sacramento. If it's going to strengthen it, great, go ahead.
So Jim, you've been working on these issues for a while. What excites you about Prop 24 in terms of its ability to improve the rights of Californians?
Well, I would say a couple things, Andrew. First of all, we're going to win, and it's the right thing. We're going to win this one. We are. The public is getting it. You know, we were really lone voices in the wilderness, Shoshana, 8 or 10 years ago, talking about this stuff. And by the way, my own kids used to say, Dad, you're so old, you don't get it. No one cares about privacy anymore. They do not think that anymore. So I think this is going to have new protections for kids and families. That's another thing that Alistair put in there. The enforcement is a really big deal, Andrew. I saw you shaking your head. You know, like, you know, you have an EPA for the environment. This is going to create an agency that protects people's privacy. That never happened before. And remember, the big thing I want to say to all the Californians out there is we are leading the nation. California, once again, is setting the standard for everybody. But so it's going to be really good for kids and families. It's going to expand protections for all of us here in this group, but it's really our kids long-term. And by the way, it's going to hold the large companies accountable, period. It's about time. I mean, when people ask me, is this a close call or a no-brainer? Because sometimes with ballot propositions, you have to ask yourself that one. Prop 24 is a no-brainer. And so we have momentum. It's good for kids. We're going to be able to enforce it. And as Alistair said, you cannot take those rights. You can't weaken it anymore. You can't water it down. And all those companies that have spent hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying against Alistair and us on this are just going to have to live with privacy. So it's a big win for everybody.
No, this is going to pass, and I think one big reason it's going to pass is that when voters see it on the ballot, they're going to instinctively know that it's trying to it's trying to fill a void, to Shoshana's point, or it's trying to address a need that's unaddressed. We could not go more extreme in the other direction. At this point, everyone knows it's like, well, I have no idea what's going on with my data, and I just click buttons, and I hear nasty things are happening. And so as soon as they see that someone's trying to do something about it, they instinctively are like, all right, I'm going to check this box because someone's trying to help. So Enoch, there are some folks watching this right now that are not in California. Why should they care about Prop 24 passing or not passing?
Yeah, because I think Professor Steyer said it best when he said California leads the nation. If Prop 24 passes, which I think it will, and it should, I think it will set the floor for the national debate for a national privacy law that we think is going to come eventually. In fact, the Senate Commerce Committee just had a hearing on September 23rd and had 5 people testify, including the Attorney General for the state of California, about federal privacy laws. And hopefully after this election, after Prop 24 passes, Congress won't be in such a stalemate and we can get some national privacy legislation using the California Privacy Rights Act as a floor. So that's the first thing, is I think non-Californians should care, because what happens in California, I think, will be adopted nationwide federally. And secondly, even if you don't live in California and you don't think that our federal Congress can get anything done, there are a number of state bills that are being proposed right now. For example, on September 9th, the state of Washington reintroduced the Washington Privacy Act for the 3rd time. And a lot of the rights in the Washington Privacy Act are based on the CCPA and the CPRA. Same for New York. I think New York was actually trying to one-up California by coming up with an even stronger privacy protection bill than the CCPA. So there's a good reason to pay attention, even if you don't live in California and can't vote on Prop 24.
It's going to be such a compelling argument to folks around the country. Why do Californians have data protections that you do not have here in Texas, Massachusetts, New York? And then the state houses are going to be like, no, we can do it too. And they will either replicate the California protections, or they will try and one-up them and go even further. So I agree with you, Enoch. What happens in California is going to have profound implications around the country. I believe the state houses are going to be ahead of the Congress on this one. I think that California is going to inspire other states, and then eventually Congress will get on board. Now, none of us suggest that anything that you come up with in life is, the platonic ideal. And there are folks that have issues with Prop 24. Some people that I believe are very, very benign and well-intended. The tech companies have problems with Prop 24 because it's going to force them to change their ways, and that we can all understand. That that's now a feature of American life. But there are other folks that have raised objections about Prop 24 as well. So I'd like to go to ask Jim, Shoshana, then Alistair, what are the objections you've heard to Prop 24? And how would you respond? So Jim, we'll start with you and then go to Shoshana and then Alistair.
The only objections that I've heard were from sort of people I would call ideologues, saying it isn't perfect. How come it isn't perfect? And the answer is because this is politics, and politics is not perfect. So there's no, look, we worked very, very closely with Alistair to pass the CCPA, the landmark law in 2018. It was also not perfect. We know that. We had to negotiate. So the only thing I've really heard that made any sense is, well, how come you couldn't, make it even tougher, right? Or put even more money into the Protection Bureau? And the answer is because politics, sometimes you have to do some compromises. And we didn't want the tech industry to spend $300 million in a no on 24 campaign. But the truth is, I haven't heard any real credible arguments about it, and other than that that it's not perfect. And the good news is it really advances the ball. And as Enoch again mentioned, hey, California's going to lead the nation and make it stronger. And I actually do believe that once we pass 24, and we will, that I think you're going to see I actually think, Andrew, next year, we're all counting on a good election result. And then I think you'll actually see federal, I know, cross fingers, but then I think I actually do think you could see federal privacy protection. But if not, California is setting an absolutely strong floor. But I don't think there are any really good arguments against it. I've not heard any, and this is the field that I work in. Alistair, what do you think?
Well, you know, it's been interesting for me, Jim, just because it's my first foray into politics. You've got a lot more experience, and it's interesting hearing people honestly say the exact opposite. So let me give you some of these. I mean, they're really actually kind of preposterous arguments. One is that it weakens privacy. And to that, all that I would say to people is, look at me, look at Jim and Common Sense Media. We worked hard to get the first one passed. On what planet would we now work hard to weaken the law? It's the most preposterous argument ever. They make the argument that somehow we promote digital redlining. I mean, the law literally gives consumers the right to stop the use of their race or ethnicity. It allows them to stop the use of this profiling. And the NAACP not only supports this, they signed the ballot argument. I mean, it's insanity. And then the one that's complicated, they keep on throwing out there is this, they call it pay for privacy. And it's complicated. All I would say about that is, look, nothing has changed. The existing law has this one section. The current law has the same section. And what I would say to people is it boils down to freedom of choice. When you go to a music streaming service, call it Spotify, some people like to pay a subscription fee and not listen to ads, and other people are fine with listening to the ads, and they want to take away that choice. And they want to say that when you choose not to listen to the ads, the business can only do one thing. So again, having been through all the arguments, the nice part is there's not one that I feel holds any water. And I would just say, I feel more affirmed at the end of it that we have the right product and that this is really a giant step forward. And as Jim says, yes, there are in everything in life, there are things that aren't perfect. I know people want us to make it stronger. When I was talking to Shoshana, she said something that has stayed with me ever since she said it. She said, Alistair, legislation is a living process. As soon as you get it passed, you work on improving it. And I think that's what's going to happen here.
Well, I know Alistair was impacted by that, Shoshana, because he said that to me and he didn't attribute it to you at the time. So Shoshana, you know, you've been working in this area for a long time. What are like the biggest barriers to getting people to pay attention? You know, like you've been writing about it, arguing for it. Like, what do we need to do better to like actually get people to care in your experience? Aside from have them listen more to Shoshana Zuboff, because I feel like that would work very well on a lot of people.
Oh my goodness, Andrew. Well, look, I have a kind of different perspective on this one. The game plan for many years now has been to normalize all the bad stuff that we've been talking about, to normalize surveillance. And the way that the big surveillance capitalists have tried to do this is with a kind of rhetoric that says, look, this isn't our fault. This is digital technology. This is the way digital technology works. These are the inevitable consequences. And so really, you just have to sort of belt up and get used to it, stiff upper lip, because this is the future. Are you against the future? Are you a Luddite? You know, this is the kind of inevitability propaganda, another form of propaganda that I have written a lot about and that I am so opposed to. But here is the really great news. The really great news is that people are not buying this. The survey research going back to the early 2000s shows that most people were never buying this. If you tipped anybody off about how this stuff is actually working, the first thing they would say is, how do I hide? How do I resist? How do I get away from this? You know, help. But increasingly, there have been very few things that we could do because, you know, this kind of iron progression, eventually every channel has come to be owned and operated by surveillance capitalism. So it's really hard to escape. But here's where we are right now. I think that it is fair to say that the American public, without exaggeration, has suffered a complete loss of faith with Facebook and with the other surveillance capitalist giants. A complete loss of faith. and it's expressed across nearly every dimension. For example, very recently, very end of 2019, Pew Research, great research operation. I'm not going to go into all of the survey results, but just one specific question that they asked. They said, are you very or somewhat concerned about the uses? No, this is the one I want to tell you about. They asked this question: are the potential risks of collecting data about you outweighed by the benefits that you receive? Do the risks outweigh the benefits? And they asked Americans to respond to that in relation to private companies and in relation to government. For the first time, these numbers flipped. 81% of Americans said that the risks of private companies collecting data outweigh the benefits, whereas only 66% said that about governments. So since the day of Snowden, these numbers have flipped. But now I want to talk about numbers that we got just this summer, Andrew, which really are extraordinary. A very comprehensive poll in the US, Knight Ridder Gallup, 74% of Americans hugely concerned about misinformation. 77% say that tech companies have too much power. 84% do not trust social media, and they don't trust social media to fix the problems that they themselves have created. 91% in another poll say that Facebook must fix misinformation. 79%, Facebook must do more to protect democracy. So the bottom line here is that we are not buying it. The public is up in arms, and I can tell you from 14 months of traveling around the world after my book was published last year, what we're hearing here in these American surveys, I heard in every city, in every country, where I often spoke to 1,000 people in an event, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times a day. This is becoming a phenomenon that we can think of as finally the politicization of that global group that were once called users. This is a river of rage, and one way or another, the tech companies are going to be held account, either because we translate it into law or because ultimately people simply withdraw from these services.
Thank you, Shoshana. I agree that the public sentiment has turned in a very, very specific direction very quickly. I don't know if, I'm sure everyone here, I mean, given who you are, but everyone watching this, the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, I feel like that has been a very useful, useful viewing experience for many people to become more sensitive and concerned about what's happening to our data. And the question really is, how do we address it? If everyone can see these problems, how do we actually start solving them? It's one reason I am so excited about Prop 24. It's unique in the country in terms of actually turning the tide. And I believe it will be like a catalyst around the country and perhaps even globally. So I want to close on a question about what it is that you would project first, you know, and you could either be pessimistic or optimistic about what you see as the future for data rights and what viewers can do to help. So I'm going to pass the baton. Jim, it sounds like you have something in this direction.
Yeah, and here's the deal. I think your question just leads into the obvious, which is you have to regulate these guys, period. That's what we learned. And we've learned this in California. We did it through the Consumer Privacy Act in 2018. Actually, we passed the eraser button law and student privacy laws a couple of years prior to that. What we realize is, and you know that we have access to, and I get to talk to the people who run all these tech companies at the CEO level. And the truth is they're not going to do it on their own. The only way that's going to happen is by regulating them, period. There's an absolute, that's why the poll numbers that Shoshana said are clear. The public has had to speak up, and that's what's happened finally. And there's been this sea change in public concern now. And that's why it's so exciting to have Prop 24 on the ballot and all the people in our audience today pushing for this. But the only way you do this and the only way we're going to save our democracy, by the way, some of the other challenges, is by regulation. Because yes, we helped a lot on the movie The Social Dilemma. We worked with the filmmakers very closely in framing that Netflix documentary. And the truth is, these guys aren't going to do it on their own. They're coining money. That's the whole point of Shoshana's book. From an economic standpoint, these guys are coining money by surveilling you. So they're selling your information and making tens of billions of dollars in the process. Bottom line is this: we have the momentum. We have the Prop 24 is sort of the really important statement that we can all get involved in. That's why it's so good to have the Yang Gang involved, Andrew, because everybody can vote for Prop 24 and you can tell your friends about it. And if you don't live in California, you can push your Congress people in 2021 and other state legislators to get this done. But we have all the momentum on our sides because it's the right thing. And it's the right thing for our kids and our future, period.
I love the Yang Gang being behind this too, because to me, this is really one more example of humanity against the machines, humanity against like the weight of the almighty dollar. Fighting for our data rights to me is a fight for humanity. So when you talk about ways to activate people around the country, Enoch, that's what the Data Dividend Project is all about, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Andrew, which is, you aren't alone in this fight, right? Individually, you may feel powerless, but as a collective, as a data union, you're going to have a lot of power to fight back and to take back our data rights and take back our data privacy from the tech companies, which is why, when we talked to you, Andrew, about starting the Data Dividend Project, you were so excited and threw your support behind it because of the authorized agent provisions in the CCPA, which allow individuals to designate agents to help them collectively negotiate and collectively bargain. I think it's just like Professor Zuboff said back in the beginning about data unions, trade associations, collective action back in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. The same thing is going to happen now in the data economy.
Yes. Alistair, let's say that we are successful and this passes. Like, what do you see as the next steps?
Well, I think, something that Shoshana said at the beginning of the thought exercise about imagining the last century, I think at some point people are going to look back on this age and say, wait a second, you mean they used to be able to use all this information for free and you really had no rights to stop them? Kind of the same way we might think about the early part of the 20th century before good wiretapping laws were in place, when you could say, wait, they could listen to the phone conversations. No one, at some point, that what we all take as for granted, I'm an optimist, and I believe that at some point what we all take for granted now will be so illegal and so far past any bound of what we all accept as society that it'll just be a historical artifact. I think what's next after this passes is continue to work on improving it here in California. That's we give the power back to the legislature. One of the good things there is Senator Hertzberg, who's the majority leader, who worked closely with us, is the majority leader. And he's there to make sure that, good things can continue to happen in terms of that living legislation. I think, common sense, one of the things that's exciting about partnering with them and with you guys, frankly, Andrew, is there's a national platform. We're a tiny little organization. They have a national platform to try to make sure that other states pursue this. So I think this is a movement whose time has come, as Shoshana was just talking about. And I think if this passes, it sets us in this country up for effective privacy legislation and regulation and rights through the whole country.
Yeah, it's so important. And the Data Dividend Project, ddpforall.com is trying to take this energy and innovation of Prop 24 and help translate it around the country. So Shoshana, you've seen so much of your work, I feel like, flower and flourish, where it sounds like you and Jim were ahead of the curve as usual. Now the curve's caught up to you. What do you project moving forward, and what are you actually excited about?
Okay, well, let me mention a couple of things. So first of all, when we think about those surveys, those survey numbers that I read to you, to me, these are people all over our country and indeed all over the world, literally howling in frustration. And some of that frustration, a lot of it is because there are not yet established channels Where do I take this frustration? What do I do with it? Where do I
Yes.
put it? How do we translate this frustration into political action and into political change? That is, for me, the biggest question right now. So we need, it's not just a matter of being able to do something in the 21st century that would be analogous to joining a trade union, or a union of any sort. It's the whole union movement. It's how we nurture activist movements. And they're not going to be like the 20th century movements. They're not going to be necessarily unions, and they're going to be new conceptions and new mechanisms and new aims. But the point is, we need robust activist groups that are helping to create these new institutions that people can channel their angst and their anger into. And we need that because folks need to be able to get activated and be constructive. But we also need that, Andrew, because if you sit on Capitol Hill and you hang out in in the office of a senator or a congressperson who's interested in this subject, as I know you have, who are the people knocking on the door every day? Who are the people that you see? You see the lobbyists.
You get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars
You
to
see
try
the
and nudge
lobbyists,
policy
Andrew,
in
they
a positive
own the
direction.
space, they own the door, they own the office, they own the hallway, they own the dining room, they own the restaurants around the block. So we need people, we need citizens there instead of lobbyists. So it's as we move into organizing and these new forms of collective action, and we get folks on Capitol Hill and our citizens are there, our warriors for democracy are there, not the lobbyists for the great surveillance capitalists. That's how things are going to change, because our lawmakers need us. They need us for cover. They need to feel us at their backs. And so all these pieces fit together. I want to add two other very quick thoughts. One is that, of course, we're going to be talking about data, and we're going to be talking about data collectivities and all of these sorts of things. But when we talk about rights in this new era, we also have to recognize that a great deal of data that has been produced is data that is fundamentally illegitimate and should never have been produced. They have no right to my face. They have no right to my micro expressions and their ability to analyze and predict my emotions, and therefore my behavior as a result of what emotions they can discern. These things are illegitimate without truly my permission and my control. So I'm going back to the need for new frameworks of elemental rights that say, I have sovereignty over my experience, and I decide what becomes data, not some company and not government surveillance. I have the right to decide. We have to establish rights that have always naturally adhered to us, but only now at this moment in history have they come under systematic threat from unprecedented power. And therefore, these rights have to travel from being elemental, natural, implicit to things that are codified in law. So that's going to be a big piece of the work we have to do next. Finally, I want to end on a very optimistic note. The way I think about it is, we're in great shape, because if we had spent the last 2 decades trying to fix this with Proposition 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 all the way up to 24, and none of it had worked, that would be real cause for depression and aggravation right now. But the fact is, that's not the case. For 20 years, these companies have had a free ride. So now, Proposition 24, earlier law in California, biometric privacy in Illinois, a variety of really important class action suits coming out of attorney general's offices around the country. We are on the move now. I say the third decade. We talked about how important the 1930s were for the 20th century. The 2020s, the third decade, this is our time. This is the decade when we have to pull it together and begin to turn the trajectory back toward a democratic digital future. I fear if we lose this decade, that turning will be far more difficult and far more violent. This is our
Amen.
decade. We come together, we get it done now, citizens and lawmakers.
This is the time. That's right. So if you're watching this and you're fired up, support Prop 24 and Californians for Consumer Privacy, Alistair initiative that we're all backing. Common Sense Media, Jim Steyer do amazing work in this space, protecting our families. Enoch Liang and the Data Dividend Project trying to take Prop 24 and translate it nationwide and see to it that that these laws get enforced effectively. And Shoshana Zuboff, you're like the intellectual forebearer of the entire thing, where you've been raising the alarm for years, and now people are waking up to what we must do. But it's not going to happen without people voting, getting behind Prop 24, and signaling to our politicians, giving them the cover that Shoshana is talking about, that we care about this, that you have to make it right, we have to make it right together, and we do not believe that tech companies are just going to somehow reform themselves because we're adults and we've been awake for the last 20 years. Thank you all so much. You're amazing. I'm thrilled to be here on this panel with you. And now we're going to open it up to some audience questions that Robin's going to convey for the folks that have been watching in the gallery. Robin, take it away.
Sure. We have a lot of great questions. And one, it's kind of a compilation of the questions that folks are asking. But what are the biggest differences between the California Consumer Privacy Act and Prop 24? I think people are saying that they've heard a lot about both, but what are the differences?
Well, I might just take that just real quick, is that if you think about where we are, we're about halfway to where we need to get to. CCPA was a great law. That's the existing law that Common Sense and Senator Hertzberg and we worked 2 years ago to get passed. The new law would take it again almost as far as we took it the first time. And so, as I said earlier, gives you the rights that Europeans enjoy. Anybody who'd like to see a real list of those, go to our website, caprivacy.org, and you can see a whole list of them. But just to reiterate some of them: new category sensitive personal information, new enforcement, new anti-profiling, new rights, new protections for kids. We triple fines for violating kids' information. So a whole ton of great stuff.
Thanks, Alistair. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in, but I think this next question is really interesting too. And it's nice that we have a Harvard business professor available to answer this. And maybe Enoch, this is a good question for you too, but it's pretty straightforward. How much is my data worth?
Professor Zuboff?
Well, how much is my data worth? Well, look, there are so many ways of thinking about that question, and how you think about it, of course, determines how you answer it. But let me put it this way. Back in the early 2000s, there was something going on called the dot-com bust. All these little internet startups were going bankrupt. Their investors were withdrawing. Google was afraid of the same thing happening to them. And that's when they began to discover and invent and deploy surveillance capitalism. They kept it a secret. And so between 2001, when they were working on it, and 2004, when they had their IPO, they went public, and we first got a look at their numbers. That was the first time anybody had any inkling of what might be going on there. What happened in that short span of time, 2001 to 2004, was Google's revenue line had increased by 3,590%. That was the difference between scraping up these predictive signals from our data exhaust using it to predict what we're going to do next, in this case, a click-through rate, and selling that prediction into a market of business customers. So that's pretty lucrative, 3,590% in just a few years. That's what I call the surveillance dividend. So the surveillance dividend has now become the carrot that every business is chasing. And of course, it can be trillions of dollars, billions of dollars, millions of dollars, depending how big your company and what business you're in. But the point is that this surveillance dividend is the markup from their stealing our personal experience, turning it into behavioral data and calling it proprietary. So that surveillance dividend gives us a standard for thinking about what that data lifted from our private experience is worth. And it's going to be worth different things in different contexts and different businesses, but that at least is a conceptual framework for how we can start to think about it.
Let me quickly add to that. The very first blog post on the Data Dividend Project's website is entitled, "What is your data worth?" And that calculation was based on the average revenue per user per quarter that's publicly reported by Facebook. And so that's one way that you can calculate what your data is worth, similar to what Professor Zuboff said in terms of the surveillance dividend. But another way that you could calculate what your data is worth, roughly, is by looking at the various class action lawsuits and class action settlements that have come out recently. For example, the Yahoo data breach settlement, I believe, was $117.5 million. And part of that settlement was to give you 2 years of credit and identity monitoring, which was valued at $386 for 2 years. Another settlement that recently came out was the Facebook biometric privacy settlement, where Facebook, without telling you, was mapping the biometrics of your face. Now that one was only for Illinois, but that was $650 million cash. And depending on how many claimants there are, that could be worth up to $400 per user. So there are these various data points that you can extrapolate from as to what your data is worth. But I think one thing worth remembering, as Professor Zuboff mentioned, is that a lot of this data was gathered illegitimately and without our permission. And that's what I think Professor Zuboff is saying a little bit about the surveillance dividend was being done behind our backs. If it's done out in the open with our permission, then I think it would be worth even more. So I hope that's an adequate answer to that question.
Robin, I would just say your data is priceless. That's what I would do. It's an existential issue. It's your data. It's your privacy. It's priceless.
There you go. There's our next campaign slogan. Okay, I see a question about current news. I have a viewer asking about recent reports that the Trump administration used data to suppress minority vote, and how would Prop 24 or other changes you're proposing affect that?
Well, I can speak to that one because honestly, Robin, the only thing I'd say is that Prop 24 doesn't really go to that issue directly. It's a consumer privacy, major improvement in consumer privacy. You know, as Alistair and Shoshana and Enoch and Andrew know, so Common Sense launched this big campaign a couple months ago called Stop Hate for Profit that we did with the NAACP and Color of Change and the ADL and others. And it was really going at the misinformation that Facebook, basic Facebook and Instagram are spreading from the campaigns. We're nonpartisan, so we don't, it involves the Trump kid. We say it for all campaigns. But the truth is the fact that the tech platforms, in particular Facebook and Instagram, have been used to undermine democracy and democratic institution and norms should outrage everybody on this call, should outrage everybody in California and around this country. It is not necessarily covered by Prop 24 per se, but but the same people who've stood up against that and have gone and have called for the ending of all this disgraceful misinformation, also the amplification of hate and racism on the Facebook and Instagram platform, is very, very consistent with what we're doing. So supporting Prop 24 means you're also supporting preservation of our democracy and our most important norms and institutions of our election. And so it's all one kindred spirit. But I don't think, Alistair, would you agree with me? It doesn't really go directly. about it.
Jim, you're right that we don't regulate political campaigning, but what I would say though is all of this, the Trump campaign trying to really diminish the votes of 3.5 million Black African Americans.
Unbelievable.
All that depends on the ability to micro-target. And the ability to micro-target, to slice all of us and dice all of us into these ever infinitely thinner slices where they literally know much more about us than we know about ourselves, because we forget, they never forget. It depends on them having access to all this data. And if I can stop them watching every step I take, if I can stop them knowing all this information about my, my sensitive personal information, my sexual orientation, my health, including my race and ethnicity, that starts to starve the beast, so to speak. It starves these giant data aggregators of all the information, which is their raw material. We are their raw material. And so I think that Jim's right, we don't precisely attack political speech, but we sure do stop some of the fuel for some of these algorithms.
I think we might have time for one more question, and I'm going to make the last one. It says that, sometimes data can help solve problems. How do you balance that against giving people privacy rights?
One of the things that I've really liked working with Jim and Shoshana, and now with more recently with Andrew and Enoch, is that none of us are extremists in the sense that you encounter plenty of people who will tell you to your face, are you going to put Facebook and Google out of business? If you're not, I don't want to be part of your campaign. And I'm like, no, we're not going to. But Jim talked about earlier, we need regulation. And Shoshana talked about it earlier. If you think about our current economy without so many of these consumer regulations, where would we be? This is nothing unexpected. This technology showed up. It spread like wildfire, and now we're saying, look, we need a little regulation. No one's talking about trying to get rid of technology, but we are trying to say, look, we need to have some balance. The balance is it's not even balance, it's a vertical line right now. They've won right now. We need to start getting a little bit back to, and to use Shoshana's example, is child labor a good idea? We start to say, should I have some rights over my data? Of course I should. So the businesses will survive just fine. I'm not worried about them. Not worried about their health, they'll do just fine. But we, the people, need some rights over our data.
Robin, I could weigh in on that with one tiny thought.
Go for it.
Is that?
Please.
Yeah? Okay. Well, just to say that the crazy situation that we're in right now is, go back to that trillions of data points ingested by the AI every day, and 6 million predictions of our behavior every second. These volumes, this scale of data is about us, but it's not for us. It's not being aggregated and analyzed to solve our problems. It's not being aggregated and analyzed to solve disease, to solve for global warming, the most trenchant, urgent problems that confront us. In fact, over the years, many people have concluded that some of the most urgent problems that confront us are the data aggregators and the aggregation itself. So here's this crazy situation. It's all about us, but it's not for us. It's sold into very distinct markets that trade in these predictions about our behavior. These are what I call human futures markets. They trade in human futures. Like we have markets that trade in pork belly futures or wheat futures or oil futures. And this is very lucrative, and this is what has produced these huge market capitalizations. So right now, if we want to get all of this data that we're capable of producing, and we want to put it to use for humanity and for the planet and for democracy, the quickest route to that outcome is to interrupt and outlaw surveillance capitalism. Then we have a fighting chance.
Thank you, Professor Zuboff. I think that closes our Q&A portion. And Jess, if you wanted to talk about what other folks can do now to help support it, I'm going to sign off.
Sure, thank you so much, Robin. We're actually going to move to closing remarks from the panelists first, and then we'll tell you where to get more information. So let's start with Jim.
Okay, thank you guys so much for coming together, and to Andrew and the Yang Gang for all the great work you've been doing. It is so fun to work with you. I mean, this has been a lovely afternoon, and I would just say to the folks in the audience, this is the standard bearers here. What a treat to be with Professor Shoshana Zuboff, and also with Enoch, who we've gotten to know through the Data Dividend Project, and our partner Alistair, who with his wife Celine has just been an incredible leader on this. Guys, we're going to win Prop 24. Get on the bandwagon, get on the train. You're in the forefront of protecting your own privacy, your family's privacy, your friends' privacy, and quite honestly, setting not just a standard for everybody in California, but for the entire country. So couldn't be more proud to be lead supporter of this, to partner with Alistair and the Yang Gang and Shoshana in this. And look, we're going to win big, and then let's build a bigger movement nationally over the next few years. Go to commonsense.org if you have any questions. We're obviously, many of you probably use our stuff for movies and TV and video games and all the other stuff we do. And I will shamelessly plug my book, since Shoshana has this fabulous piece in it. It's called Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy in Our Lives. And there's a ton of stuff in there from folks like Shoshana about privacy and about how we need to take back our democracy and need to take back our lives. So thank you so much for having us part of this. Alistair and Celine, thanks so much for your leadership on this. And we're proud to be part of Prop 24, and we're going to win. You heard it here.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And if you keep your eye on the chat, Christina is posting links, and there is a link to commonsense.org in there. Enoch, we will give it to you.
It's been an absolute honor to be on this panel. Thank you so much to the California Yang Gang for putting this together. And if you'd like to join the movement, go to datadividendproject.com and review our website and sign up to join the movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been great hearing from you. All right, Professor Zuboff.
Well, look, if you are listening and you're in California and you vote in California, the place where I want to land in this conversation is vote. Vote early, vote safe, but vote. If you want to know the place where privacy and individual sovereignty and democracy all meet, it's right there in your vote, right there in your ballot. Everyone in the country is looking to California to redefine the frontier, especially now with Prop 24, especially in this domain of privacy, which has become so urgently important to all of us as we see our democratic institutions under threat. Vote. God bless. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, vote. Thank you, Professor Zuboff. It's been wonderful having you on this panel. Alistair, we will let you have the last word.
Well, you know, I think when I got into this work, it was with a thought of a smaller vision of privacy about, you know, what was in your shopping cart and who knew what I was doing. Now I've come to see it in a larger context. And if you want to think about, you know, I'm old enough to remember when there was the Iron Curtain across Europe. There's now the data curtain across certain societies in the world. And this technology is great for keeping, you know, a population surveilled and under you know, lock and key essentially. And we've seen certain societies, certain authoritarian societies around the world do that. While we criticize those societies, in many cases, these businesses in our world are the size of nation states. You know, Google and Microsoft would be, I think, 26 and 27 in terms of a country, the size of them. I'm not anti-technology, but we are desperately in need of some of this regulation in order to preserve the way of life that we have building up here for the past 2 centuries. So I hope you will vote yes on 26. 24. I added 2 more there. I hope you vote yes on 24. And thank you all. Really want to thank the panelists. Thank Andrew and Enoch for getting involved here. And thank Shoshana and Jim for their years of leadership in this area. It's a real honor to be on this whole panel. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alistair. And thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a wonderful event. So grateful we had this wealth of knowledge to come together to talk about privacy and Prop 24 today. If you want to learn more about Prop 24, please go to the website listed on the screen right now, caprivacy.org. And we are having a day of action on Tuesday, October 6th. We hope you will join us for that. You can find the link here, and it will also be dropped in the chat. It's going to be things you can do on your own, so you can social distance. And if you want any more information, you can get in touch with the California Yang Gang on social media. These are the wonderful organizations that collaborated to bring you this event today. And we just want to say again, thank you so much.
24, Prop 24. Don't sell my data, lose my location, my health, my race, religion, and whatever else you're saving, it's not yours to keep. I do not give you permission. Don't be a creep. Stay out of the children's business. They should pay a fine. They should pay a fine. Prop 24. Vote yes for your data rights. Prop 24.